Hey there, and welcome to Crime for Sleep. I know you're having trouble falling asleep, so let me keep you company with true crime stories from around the world. Before we dive in, I'm curious, where did you first hear this one? If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Now get comfortable, and let's get into tonight's case. Story 1. The alarm ticked without ringing, a silent countdown or maybe an echo. Each step toward the kitchen felt miscalculated, landing offbeat on the worn linoleum which always squeaked left but today sang right. Coffee untouched, yet the cup bore a lipstick stain, a color I'd never worn. As fingers brushed the rim, a shiver coursed through me, a warmth where chill was expected. It was only Tuesday, yet every clock claimed Wednesday. I reached for the calendar and it was blank. That lipstick mark, cherry red, or was it burgundy? The shade keeps shifting in my memory like smoke through glass. I remember standing there staring at that cup. The kitchen window faced something a yard, maybe, or another building. The light was wrong, too bright for morning, too dim for afternoon. I kept trying to place when I'd made the coffee, but the memory wouldn't form. Like reaching for water with your hands cupped, watching it slip through your fingers. There was a sound, a humming. Not from the refrigerator, that old thing wheezed more than hummed. This was different, musical, someone singing under their breath, the way you do when you think nobody's listening. But the house was empty, had to be. I lived alone. Didn't I? The cup felt warm in my hands, fresh, but I couldn't remember brewing anything. The coffee maker sat cold and unplugged in the corner, its carafe bone dry. Yet here was this cup, steam still rising in lazy spirals, and that mark on the rim like a kiss goodbye. I started checking things. The front door locked from the inside, chain latched, back door the same. Windows shut tight, screens intact. No signs anyone had been there. But the humming lingered in the air, a melody I almost recognized but couldn't quite place. The calendar hung crooked on the wall beside the refrigerator, all the pages blank like someone had erased everything that mattered. I flipped through the months looking for something, anything to anchor me to a specific moment, but each page stared back empty and accusing. That's when I noticed the photographs. They lined the hallway leading to the bedrooms, frames I'd walked past countless times without really seeing. Family photos, I thought, the usual collection of faces and smiles and captured moments that fill up the spaces between rooms. But when I looked closer, really looked, the faces were all wrong. Not wrong exactly, familiar, but like seeing yourself in a funhouse mirror, recognizable yet distorted. A woman with my eyes but sharper cheekbones. A man with my father's hands but younger, smoother. Children who might have been my siblings if I'd had any, playing in a backyard that looked like mine but wasn't. I touched one of the frames. The glass was dusty, like it had been hanging there for years. But underneath the dust, the photo looked new, fresh. The colors too vivid, the smiles too perfect. The humming started again. This time I followed it, down the hallway, past those strange, familiar faces, toward the bedroom at the end. My bedroom had to be. I'd lived here long enough to know my own house, even if everything else felt like walking through someone else's dream. The door stood slightly ajar. I pushed it open, expecting to find the source of that melody, but the room was empty. Bed made with military precision, corners tucked tight, dresser clear except for a single item I didn't remember placing there. A tube of lipstick, cherry red or burgundy. I picked it up, turned it over in my palm. The bottom was worn smooth, like someone had been rolling it between their fingers for a long time. When I twisted the base, the color emerged rich and dark, the exact shade that marked the coffee cup. But I'd never owned lipstick this color. never worn red, too bold, too attention-seeking. I preferred neutral tones, barely their shades that whispered instead of announced. So where had it come from? I caught my reflection in the dresser mirror and froze. My lips were stained, not heavily, just a faint trace of color like I'd been drinking from that marked cup, but I hadn't touched it to my mouth. Had I, the memory felt slippery, unreliable. The humming swelled again, and this time I realized it wasn't coming from inside the house. It drifted through the bedroom window, carried on air that tasted of rain and something else. Something sweet and cloying that made my stomach turn. I pulled back the curtains and looked out. The yard stretched away from the house, longer than it should have been, deeper. At the far end where the fence should have stood, shadows gathered in shapes that almost looked like people. Almost, but when I blinked, they shifted and dissolved, leaving only the impression of movement where there should have been stillness. One shadow seemed taller than the others. It swayed slightly, like someone standing in a breeze I couldn't feel. And from that direction, the humming grew stronger, more insistent. I knew that melody. Somewhere buried in my memory, I knew it. But every time I reached for the recognition, it slipped away like that water through my fingers. The lipstick grew warm in my palm. I looked down and realized I'd been gripping it so tightly my knuckles had gone white. When I loosened my hold, there were marks on my skin. Not bruises exactly, but impressions. Like someone else's fingers had been wrapped around mine, guiding my grip. I set the tube back on the dresser, but it rolled toward the mirror, coming to rest against the glass. In the reflection, it looked different, older, used up. The gold casing tarnished and dented, like something that had been lost and found and lost again. The coffee cup was still warm when I returned to the kitchen. That shouldn't have been possible. I'd been gone long enough for it to cool, long enough for the steam to dissipate. But there it sat, that cherry red mark on the rim, heat rising from the dark surface like a promise or a threat. I tried to remember making it, tried to place myself in this kitchen at some earlier time, going through the motions of grinding beans and measuring water and waiting for that first perfect cup. But the memory wouldn't come. Instead, I saw flashes of something else. Hands that weren't mine reaching for the coffee maker, a voice that sounded almost like mine but not quite, humming that same melody while the machine gurgled and hissed. A reflection in the kitchen window that moved independently, turning to smile at me with lips painted cherry red. Or burgundy. The color kept shifting in my mind, like looking at it through water. Sometimes bright and bold, sometimes dark and muted. Sometimes fresh and glossy, sometimes old and cracked like paint on a weathered fence. I found myself at the kitchen table, though I didn't remember sitting down. The chair felt wrong under me, too high or too low, like it had been adjusted for someone else's body, someone taller or shorter. The details kept blurring together, refusing to hold still long enough for me to examine them properly. On the table beside the cup lay a piece of paper I hadn't noticed before, cream-colored, expensive-looking, the kind of stationery people used for important letters or formal invitations. But when I picked it up, it was blank except for a single line written in handwriting I almost recognized. "You promise to remember." The words were written in what looked like lipstick, cherry red or burgundy. The color had bled slightly into the paper fibers, creating a soft, blurred effect that made the letters seem to pulse and shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Promise to remember what and to whom? I turned the paper over looking for more clues, but the back was empty except for a faint impression, like someone had written on another sheet while this one lay underneath. I held it up to the light, trying to make out the ghost words, but they remained stubbornly illegible. The humming started again, closer this time, right behind me. I spun around, but the kitchen was empty. Just me and the warm coffee in that lipstick-stained cup. But the melody lingered in the air, familiar and haunting, like a lullaby half remembered from childhood. Or maybe not childhood, maybe something more recent, something I was supposed to remember but couldn't quite grasp. I closed my eyes and let the melody wash over me, hoping it would trigger some buried memory. And slowly, like fog lifting from a lake, images began to surface. A woman sitting at this same table, humming while she wrote on cream-colored paper, her lips moving soundlessly, forming words I couldn't hear. She looked up at me and smiled, and her mouth was painted that same shifting shade of red. But when she smiled, her teeth were all wrong. The image shattered like glass, leaving me gasping in the empty kitchen. My hands were shaking and the paper fluttered to the floor. When I bent to retrieve it, the words had changed. "You promised to forget." I read it again, sure I was mistaken, but the letters remained stubbornly clear, written in that same bleeding lipstick. The exact opposite of what I'd seen before, yet somehow the handwriting looked identical. Had I misread it the first time, or was something else happening here, something that defied explanation? I set the paper on the table and backed away, no longer trusting what my eyes were telling me. The coffee cup sat there, innocent and ordinary, but I could swear the lipstick mark had grown larger, darker, more distinct. Like someone had taken another sip while I wasn't looking. The photographs in the hallway had changed too. When I walked past them again, the faces were different, still familiar, still wrong, but arranged in new configurations. The woman with my eyes now stood beside a man I didn't recognize. The children played with toys that looked like the ones I'd had as a child, but in colors that hurt to look at. In one frame near the end of the hall, a new photo had appeared. It showed this very kitchen, but from an angle I'd never seen before. High up, like someone had been standing on a chair or ladder. In the image, two figures sat at the table. One was clearly me, though my hair was different, longer. The other was partially obscured, turned away from the camera. But I could see the lipstick tube in her hand, cherry red gleaming in the kitchen light. I touched the glass and it was warm, fresh, like the photo had been taken moments before, though I had no memory of anyone else being in the house. No memory of sitting at that table with another person, sharing coffee and conversation and secrets written on expensive paper. The humming grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to come from everywhere now, the walls, the floors, the very air itself. A melody that wrapped around me like smoke, familiar and frightening and impossible to escape. I followed it back to the bedroom, drawn by something I couldn't name. The lipstick tube still sat beside the mirror, but now the cap was off. The color had been twisted up, exposed and vulnerable. In the mirror's reflection, I could see myself holding it, though my actual hands were empty. My reflection raised the lipstick to her lips and began to apply it with practiced ease. Smooth, confident strokes that spoke of long familiarity. When she was finished, she smiled at me and her teeth were perfect, white and straight and absolutely normal. But I could taste the waxy sweetness on my own lips, feel the unfamiliar weight of color I'd never chosen to wear. I raised my hand to my mouth and my fingers came away stained, cherry red or burgundy, the shade that marked the coffee cup, that wrote messages on cream-colored paper, that painted promises and lies in equal measure. The woman in the mirror mouthed something I couldn't hear. Her lips moved carefully, deliberately, forming words that should have been clear but remained frustratingly silent. She pointed to something behind me, and I turned to look, but there was nothing there. When I looked back, the mirror showed only my own reflection. Normal, familiar, my lips bare of any color, though I could still taste the waxy sweetness on my tongue. The humming stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete it felt like falling. In that silence, I heard something else, footsteps, soft and careful, moving through the house like someone trying not to be noticed. But I was alone, had to be. The doors were locked, the windows secure. No one could have gotten in without me knowing. Could they? I crept to the bedroom doorway and listened. The footsteps had stopped, but I could feel a presence in the house. Something waiting, watching, breathing in rhythm with my own heartbeat. The kitchen call to me drew me back like a magnet. The coffee cup sat exactly where I'd left it, but the liquid inside was gone, drained. Only the lipstick mark remained, a perfect crescent of color against white porcelain. Beside it, the cream-colored paper bore new words. You always were forgetful. The handwriting was different this time, looser, more casual, like someone writing a quick note before rushing out the door. But the lipstick color was the same, that shifting shade that refused to hold still in my memory. I sank into the chair, overwhelmed by the impossibility of it all. Alone in a house that felt foreign, surrounded by evidence of someone else's presence. Someone who knew me well enough to predict my movements, to leave messages in places I was sure to find them. Someone who wore my lipstick and drank from my cup and hummed melodies that echoed in the spaces between my thoughts. The blank calendar mocked me from the wall, its empty squares a reminder of all the things I couldn't remember. Had I torn out the pages myself, hidden them somewhere safe, or had someone else erased the evidence of whatever I was supposed to recall? I stood and walked to the calendar, running my fingers along its empty surface. The paper was smooth, unmarked, but underneath I could feel the ghost impressions of writing, appointments and reminders and important dates pressed into the pages below. With a pencil from the kitchen drawer, I began to shade lightly over the impressions, hoping to reveal what had been erased. Slowly, faintly, words began to appear. Names I didn't recognize, places I'd never been, and scattered throughout like a signature or a promise, the same phrase repeated over and over. Remember me. The pencil slipped from my fingers, clattering to the floor. Those words, written in my own hand, filled the calendar squares like a prayer or a curse. Some entries were circled, others crossed out. A few were written in what looked like lipstick, that same shifting red that marked everything else. I backed away from the calendar, my heart hammering against my ribs. This was my handwriting, my calendar, my desperate attempts to hold onto something that kept slipping away. But I couldn't remember writing any of it. The house felt smaller suddenly, like the walls were pressing inward. Every shadow seemed to hide a secret, every corner to conceal a truth I wasn't ready to face. The air grew thick and hard to breathe, tasting of that sweet, cloying scent that drifted through the bedroom window. I needed air, space, distance from whatever was happening in this place that should have been home but felt like a trap. The front door fought me, the lock sticking as if it hadn't been used in a long time. When it finally opened, I stumbled onto the porch, gasping in the cooler air outside. The world beyond my door looked wrong too. The street stretched in both directions, but I couldn't see where it led. Houses lined both sides, but they were empty of detail, like a painting that hadn't been finished. No cars, no people, no signs of life except for the humming that followed me even here. I turned back to my own house, seeing it from the outside for the first time in what felt like forever. The windows were dark, but in one of them, the bedroom window, a figure stood watching me. It was myself, but not. Same face, same build, but wearing that cherry red lipstick like a mask. She raised her hand in a small wave, and I found myself waving back before I could stop myself. When I blinked, she was gone. I went back inside, no longer sure what was real and what was memory and what was something else entirely. The house welcomed me back with familiar sounds, the creak of floorboards, the whisper of air through vents, the soft tick of that silent alarm. In the kitchen, a fresh cup of coffee waited on the table, still warm, still marked with that perfect crescent of color. Beside it, the cream-colored paper bore one final message. Welcome home. The handwriting was mine, but I had no memory of writing it. The lipstick was mine, but I'd never chosen that shade. The house was mine, but it felt like visiting someone else's life. I picked up the cup, careful to avoid the stained rim, and took a sip. The coffee was perfect, exactly how I liked it, though I couldn't remember making it. As the warmth spread through me, fragments of memory began to surface. Sitting at this table with someone who looked like me but wasn't, sharing stories and secrets and promises we both knew we couldn't keep. Writing messages to myself in lipstick because ink seemed too permanent, too real. Planning something or forgetting something, the details blurred together like watercolors in rain. The alarm ticked without ringing, marking time that didn't exist. I set down the cup and my lips left their own mark beside the first one, a different shade, my natural color, pale and uncertain. 2 marks on one cup, 2 women in one house, 2 versions of a truth I couldn't quite remember. The humming started again, but this time I recognized the voice. It was mine, echoing back from some other time, some other version of events where things had gone differently, where promises had been kept and memories had stayed intact and lipstick had remained in its proper tube instead of writing messages on calendars and mirrors and cream-colored paper. I closed my eyes and let the melody carry me back to that kitchen, that table, that moment when everything had made sense, when I had known who I was and why I was there and what I was supposed to remember. But when I opened my eyes again, I was alone with the warm cup and the silent alarm and the growing certainty that I had been here before, would be here again, caught in a loop of forgetting and remembering that had no beginning and no end. The lipstick tube rolled across the table toward me, coming to rest against my hand. When I picked it up, it was warm from someone else's touch, someone else's fingers, someone else's desperate need to leave a mark that would last longer than memory. I twisted the base and the color emerged rich and dark and familiar, cherry red or burgundy, the shade of promises and lies and all the truths we tell ourselves when the alternative is too frightening to face. The alarm ticked without ringing, and I began to understand that some countdowns never reach 0. Story 2. I had been fixed on the corner of the room where the picture frame should have been. The curtains fluttered slightly, though the windows had been shut tight earlier. Dust swirled in patterns of its own making, settling uneasily in the stillness. The air felt thick, almost tangible, as if holding a secret I wasn't meant to uncover. Every creak from the floor seemed rehearsed, predictable, yet unnerving. My gaze refused to shift, waiting for a sign, any break in the decorum of silence. Then, from the corner of my eye, a shadow lengthened without a source. The frame was missing its absence, more alarming than any sound. The house belonged to my sister. She had called me 3 days earlier, her voice carrying that particular strain I recognized from childhood, the way she spoke when she was trying to convince herself everything was fine. She needed me to check on things while she was away, she said. Just a quick look around, water the plants, collect the mail. Simple enough. But standing in her living room now, nothing felt simple. The missing frame had contained a photograph of our parents, taken at some family gathering I could barely remember. A mundane image that had sat in that corner for as long as I could recall visiting this place. Its absence created a void that seemed to pulse with significance. I moved closer to examine the wall. A faint rectangular outline marked where the frame had hung, the paint slightly darker within those boundaries. No nail holes, no torn wallpaper, as if someone had carefully lifted it away, leaving behind only the ghost of its presence. The floorboards beneath my feet groaned with each step, a sound I had never noticed before during my visits. Perhaps my sister's presence had always masked these small disturbances, her voice filling the spaces where silence might otherwise take hold. Now alone, every sound seemed amplified and deliberate. I found myself retracing the conversation we had shared before her departure. She had mentioned needing time to think, to sort through some complications at work. Her supervisor had been asking questions about discrepancies in client accounts, nothing serious. She assured me just paperwork that needed clarification. She worked at a financial firm downtown, handling estate settlements and trust funds, meticulous work that required absolute accuracy. The kitchen revealed more subtle disturbances. Cabinet doors hung slightly ajar, as if someone had opened them quickly and forgotten to close them properly. Inside, dishes sat in neat stacks, but their arrangement felt wrong somehow. Too perfect, too deliberately organized. My sister had always been tidy, but this level of precision suggested something beyond her usual care. A coffee cup sat in the sink, its interior stained dark brown. I lifted it to examine the residue more closely, catching a faint scent that didn't match the coffee brand she typically used. Something earthier, more bitter. The smell triggered a memory I couldn't quite grasp, a conversation overheard perhaps, or a moment witnessed but not fully processed at the time. Her desk in the corner revealed similar oddities. Papers arranged in perfectly aligned stacks, pens lined up with military precision. The computer screen was dark, its surface reflecting my own uncertain expression back at me. I hesitated before touching the mouse, unsure whether I was crossing a boundary she would want respected. The screen flickered to life, revealing a desktop background I didn't recognize, a stark landscape of bare trees against a gray sky. Her usual preference ran toward brighter images, flowers or cityscapes that reflected her generally optimistic nature. This felt like someone else's choice entirely. Recent documents showed files with cryptic names, reconciliation drafts, account summaries, correspondence marked as urgent. I opened one at random, finding columns of numbers that meant nothing to me, but their organization suggested careful tracking of something significant. Amounts that seemed too large for typical household expenses, dates that clustered around specific periods. A sound from upstairs made me freeze. Not quite footsteps, but a settling noise that suggested movement above. The house was old, prone to expansion and contraction as temperatures changed. Yet this sound carried a different quality, more purposeful than random settling. I climbed the stairs slowly, my hand trailing along the banister. Each step seemed to echo longer than it should, as if the sound was being absorbed and then released by the walls themselves. The hallway stretched before me, doors to bedrooms and bathrooms standing slightly open, creating gaps of shadow that my eyes couldn't penetrate completely. Her bedroom appeared undisturbed at first glance. The bed was made with hospital corner precision, pillows arranged symmetrically against the headboard, but the dresser top, usually cluttered with jewelry and cosmetics, had been cleared completely. Not cleaned, cleared, as if someone had swept everything into a container and removed it entirely. The closet door stood open, revealing clothes hanging in perfect intervals, too perfect. I ran my hand along the garments, feeling the fabric beneath my fingers, searching for some indication of recent disturbance. Near the back, I found a gap in the arrangement where something had been removed. The hangers on either side leaned slightly inward, creating a space that felt deliberately concealed. On the floor of the closet, a small suitcase sat partially hidden behind longer garments. I pulled it out, surprised by its weight. The latches opened easily, revealing contents that made my breath catch. Bundles of cash, neatly wrapped in rubber bands, not enormous amounts, but more money than anyone would typically keep at home. Beneath the cash, documents bearing official seals and signatures I didn't recognize. One document caught my attention, a power of attorney form with my sister's signature, granting someone else authority over financial decisions. The beneficiary's name had been carefully obscured with black ink, leaving only the legal framework visible. The date on the form was recent, within the past month. My phone vibrated against my leg, startling me from my examination of the papers. A text message from my sister. "How does everything look? Hope you found what you needed." The phrasing struck me as odd. I hadn't mentioned looking for anything specific, only checking on the house as she had requested. I typed back, "Everything seems fine. Missing picture frame in the living room though." The response came quickly. "Which frame?" As if she genuinely didn't know, though the missing photograph had been such a prominent feature of the room. Another message followed. "Had to move some things around before leaving. Don't worry about it." But her earlier tone had suggested she expected me to find something, not that she had deliberately moved items herself. I returned to the living room, studying the space where the frame had hung. The shadow I had noticed earlier seemed to have shifted, though I couldn't identify any light source that would cause such movement. The curtains remained still now, no longer fluttering despite the closed windows. Sitting in her favorite chair, I tried to reconstruct the sequence of events that had led to this moment. My sister's phone call, her request for help, the careful way she had avoided specifics about her work situation. The missing photograph, the organized chaos of her personal belongings, the hidden suitcase filled with cash and legal documents. A memory surfaced from our last conversation before this one. She had mentioned a client who had become difficult, making accusations about missing funds from their account. She had laughed it off at the time, describing the person as confused and possibly suffering from memory issues. But her laughter had carried a nervous quality that I had dismissed then, but now seemed significant. The financial documents on her computer began to make more sense in this context. Not personal records, but client accounts she had been managing. The large amounts, the careful tracking, the urgent correspondence, all potentially related to the accusations she had mentioned. But this interpretation raised more questions than it answered. If she was innocent of any wrongdoing, why the hidden cash? Why the power of attorney document with the obscured name? Why had she asked me to check on things, using language that suggested I might find something specific? My phone rang, displaying her number. I answered cautiously. "Did you find everything okay?" Her voice carried that same strained quality from our earlier conversation. "I found some things," I replied, choosing my words carefully. "Maybe we should talk about what's been happening." A pause stretched between us, filled with static and the sound of her breathing. "I know how this must look," she said finally, "but it's not what you think." "What is it, then?" "Insurance," she said, "against people who might want to hurt me. The client I mentioned, they're not just confused. They've been making threats, suggesting they'll involve authorities unless I pay them money I don't owe." This explanation felt both plausible and incomplete, so the cash upstairs. Another pause, "Evidence," she said, "of what they're trying to extort from me. I documented everything, kept records of their demands. The power of attorney is part of it. They wanted me to sign over access to other accounts." "Why didn't you just go to the police?" "Because they're claiming I stole from them first. It becomes a matter of who gets believed, and they have resources I don't. I needed time to gather proof of what's really happening." Her explanation had a logical structure, but something about it felt rehearsed. Too neat, too conveniently addressing each of my concerns. Yet I wanted to believe her, wanted this to be a simple case of someone being victimized by a manipulative client. "Where are you now?" I asked. "Somewhere safe. I'll be back once this gets resolved. Just give me a few more days." After she hung up, I remained in the chair, staring at the empty space on the wall. Her explanation addressed the facts I had discovered, but it didn't account for the feeling that had drawn me to that missing frame in the first place. The sense that something fundamental had been removed, not just relocated. I walked to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator, finding it nearly empty except for condiments and a few items approaching their expiration dates. If she had planned a brief trip, she had prepared as if leaving for much longer. The milk was dated from over a week ago, suggesting she had stopped buying perishables well before her departure. The coffee cup in the sink drew my attention again. I lifted it once more, inhaling the residual scent, not just bitter, but carrying an undertone of something medicinal. Not the kind of coffee someone would choose to drink, but perhaps something they would consume for other reasons. In the bathroom medicine cabinet, I found gaps where bottles had been removed. Not a complete clearing like the dresser, but selective removal of specific items. Prescription bottles were gone, leaving behind only over-the-counter medications and toiletries. These details suggested preparation for a longer absence than she had indicated, or perhaps preparation for an absence with no planned return date. The careful removal of identifying documents, the cash converted to untraceable form, the elimination of anything that might provide clues to future whereabouts. Yet her story about extortion and threats could still be true. Someone in that situation might well prepare for the possibility of needing to disappear quickly. The missing photograph might have been removed because it contained identifying information that could be used to track her. I found myself caught between two equally plausible interpretations of the same evidence. Either my sister was a victim preparing to protect herself from a dangerous situation, or she was someone who had committed financial crimes and was now arranging her escape from the consequences. The missing frame continued to dominate my attention, its absence seeming to grow more pronounced as the afternoon wore on. I searched through closets and storage areas, thinking perhaps she had simply moved it for safekeeping, but the photograph was nowhere to be found in the house. In the basement, I discovered boxes that hadn't been there during previous visits. They contained more financial records, but these were older, dating back several years. Client files from her work, organized by date and account number. I recognized some of the names elderly clients she had mentioned in passing during family conversations. One file was significantly thicker than the others, containing not just financial records but personal correspondence. Letters written in shaky handwriting, expressing gratitude for her help managing complex estate issues. The client had been elderly and alone, relying entirely on my sister's guidance for financial decisions. The final letter in the file was different in tone. Confusion about missing funds, questions about transactions the client didn't remember authorizing. The handwriting was more erratic, suggesting either emotional distress or declining cognitive function. My sister had written responses, patiently explaining each transaction, providing documentation for every expense. But attached to these explanations were copies of documents that seemed to contradict her written responses. Bank statements showing withdrawals that didn't match the amounts she had claimed. Transfer records indicating money moved to accounts not mentioned in her letters to the client. This discovery shifted my understanding once again. The evidence suggested not extortion by a client, but potential theft by my sister from someone who trusted her completely. The threatening client she had mentioned might be someone who had finally recognized what was happening to their finances. Yet even this interpretation felt incomplete. The documents were organized too carefully, the contradictions too obvious to someone examining them closely. If she had been stealing from clients, why keep such detailed evidence of her crimes? Why make it so easy for someone to discover what she had done? My phone buzzed with another message. I know you're trying to understand. Meet me tomorrow at the place where we used to feed the ducks. Come alone and I'll explain everything. The reference to feeding ducks triggered a childhood memory of visits to a pond in the park near our childhood home. We had gone there regularly with our parents, bringing stale bread to throw to the waterfowl. An innocent memory now serving as a coded meeting location. Her choice of this place suggested she was still nearby, not fleeing to some distant location as I had begun to suspect. But it also indicated a level of caution about being observed or overheard that reinforced my growing concerns about the situation. I spent the evening in her house, unable to shake the feeling that I was missing something crucial. The missing photograph had started this investigation, but it had led me to discoveries that seemed far more significant than a single removed item. Yet I couldn't escape the sense that everything else was somehow connected to that empty space on the wall. During the night, I was awakened by sounds from downstairs. Not the settling noises I had heard earlier, but deliberate movement. Footsteps crossing the living room, the soft closing of a door. I lay still, listening, trying to determine whether someone had entered the house, or if these were simply the sounds of an old building adjusting to temperature changes. When I finally gathered courage to investigate, I found the front door unlocked, though I was certain I had secured it before going upstairs. Nothing appeared to have been disturbed, but the feeling of intrusion was unmistakable. Someone had been inside, moving through the rooms with familiarity, looking for something specific. In the morning, I discovered what they had been seeking. The suitcase in the bedroom closet was gone, along with its contents of cash and documents. Only the impression in the carpet remained, showing where it had sat hidden behind the hanging clothes. This development suggested that my sister was not acting alone. Someone else had access to the house, knew where she had hidden the money, and felt comfortable entering during the night to retrieve it. Either an accomplice helping her escape, or someone else entirely who had been monitoring the situation. The meeting at the pond took on new significance in light of this discovery. Was she planning to explain her actions and ask for my help, Or was this an attempt to manipulate me into providing some form of assistance with whatever she was trying to accomplish? I arrived at the park early, choosing a bench with clear sightlines in all directions. The pond was smaller than I remembered from childhood, its surface reflecting the gray sky in ripples that distorted the image of clouds passing overhead. A few ducks paddled near the shore, presumably descendants of those we had fed decades earlier. She approached from the parking area, walking slowly as if reluctant to close the distance between us. Her appearance had changed since our last meeting, hair pulled back severely, clothes that seemed chosen for practicality rather than style. She looked like someone preparing for a long journey or extended period of hiding. "Thank you for coming," she said, settling onto the bench beside me but maintaining careful distance. "I know what you must think after finding everything in the house." "I'm not sure what I think," I replied honestly. "The evidence seems to point in multiple directions." She nodded as if expecting this response. "That's intentional. I needed to create enough confusion to buy myself time to figure out what to do next." "About what?" "About the client who died last month, the one whose file you found in the basement." Her voice carried a heaviness that suggested genuine grief. She trusted me completely, and I failed her. This revelation reframed everything I had discovered. Not theft from a living client, but something that had happened after someone's death. How did you fail her? By not recognizing what her nephew was doing. He had been pressuring her to change her will, to give him power of attorney over her accounts. She resisted, but he kept pushing, making her feel guilty about not trusting family. When she finally agreed, he started moving money immediately. "And you helped with this." I processed the transactions he requested, thinking they were legitimate. She had given him legal authority, and the amounts weren't unreasonable for someone managing an elderly person's expenses. It wasn't until after she died that I realized how much he had taken. The story was becoming clearer, but it still didn't explain all the evidence I had found. So why the cash in your house? Why the preparation to disappear? Because he's claiming I was the one who stole from her. He's threatening to go to authorities with evidence that makes it look like I manipulated her into giving me access to her accounts. Documents with forged signatures, transaction records that have been altered to show larger amounts going to accounts connected to me. This explanation fit with what I had observed, but questions remained. Why not just tell the truth to the police? Because he's been very clever about creating false evidence. Bank statements that show money going to accounts that were opened in my name without my knowledge. Witnesses who will testify that I visited her frequently and seemed to have unusual influence over her decisions. It becomes a matter of proving a negative that I didn't do something which is nearly impossible. We sat in silence for several minutes, watching the ducks navigate the pond's surface. Her explanation had a logical consistency that was convincing, yet something about it still felt incomplete. Too many details aligned too neatly with the evidence I had discovered. "The photograph that's missing from your living room," I said finally. "Why did you remove that specifically?" She turned to look at me directly for the first time since arriving, because it showed all of us together at her birthday party last year. If authorities start investigating, they'll want to document every connection between us. I didn't want them to have easy access to evidence of our family relationship. She was connected to our family. She was our grandmother's neighbor for decades, practically family, even though we weren't related by blood. That's why she trusted me with her financial affairs and why the nephew's accusations are so damaging. It looks like I took advantage of a family relationship to gain access to her money. This final piece of information changed everything. The missing photograph wasn't just evidence of their professional relationship, but documentation of personal connections that could be misinterpreted by investigators. Her careful preparation wasn't the behavior of a criminal fleeing justice, but someone trying to protect herself from false accusations backed by fabricated evidence. Yet doubt continued to gnaw at me. Her explanations were too comprehensive, addressing every question I might raise. Either she was telling the complete truth, or she had anticipated my discoveries and prepared responses designed to maintain my trust and support. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "Time," she said. "I'm working with a lawyer to gather evidence of what the nephew really did, but he's been threatening to file charges against me if I don't drop my investigation into his activities. I need somewhere safe to stay while we build a case that will expose his fraud. And if I help you and you're lying to me about what really happened." She was quiet for a long time before answering. "Then you'll have helped someone who took advantage of your trust, just like I'm claiming he took advantage of hers. I can't prove to you that I'm innocent any more than I can prove it to the authorities. You have to decide whether you believe me based on what you know about who I am." The conversation ended with no clear resolution. She asked me to maintain the house for a few more weeks while she worked with her lawyer. I agreed, though uncertainty continued to plague my decision. The evidence I had found could support either interpretation of events theft by my sister or a complex frame-up by someone else. Returning to her house that evening, I noticed the missing photograph's absence seemed less pronounced. Perhaps because I now understood why it had been removed, or perhaps because other mysteries had overshadowed that initial discovery. The empty space on the wall remained, but it no longer felt like the most important question demanding answers. I found myself wondering whether resolution was even possible in a situation like this. The truth might be knowable in some objective sense, but proving it to others or even to myself might require more evidence than would ever become available. Sometimes the best we can do is make decisions based on incomplete information and hope our judgment proves sound. The house settled into its evening rhythms around me, creaks and sighs that no longer seemed ominous but simply part of an old building's natural behavior. Whether my sister was victim or perpetrator, the immediate crisis had passed. She was safe, at least temporarily, and working towards some form of resolution. But the missing frame continued to draw my attention, its absence a reminder that some questions resist easy answers. In the growing darkness, that empty space on the wall seemed to expand, encompassing not just the missing photograph, but all the uncertainties that would remain regardless of how this situation ultimately resolved itself. Story 3. It came as a persistent ticking, each beat too precise, too calculated, yet without a visible source. I stood in the kitchen mid-motion as the sound seemed to weave itself into the very air around me. The faucet was still, the clock above the stove frozen in its own silence. Yet the ticking persisted, growing louder, like it belonged to something buried deep within the walls or perhaps the recesses of my own mind. A shiver passed through me, an echo of a place where time was both prisoner and warden. The urge to locate it clawed at me, but every step I took only tightened the sound's hold, anchoring me in its rhythm. I hadn't felt this urgency since the last time it happened. The last time, those words hang in my mind like smoke, refusing to dissipate. I know exactly when that was 3 weeks ago when I found her in the basement, my sister. She'd been missing for 2 days and everyone was frantic, calling hospitals, filing reports, but I knew where to look. Something had drawn me down those concrete steps, past the musty smell of old cardboard boxes and forgotten Christmas decorations. She was sitting on the floor, knees drawn to her chest, staring at the wall where the old furnace used to be. When I called her name, she turned to me with eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. She was shivering, though the basement wasn't particularly cold. Her lips moved silently, as if she was counting something only she could see. "I've been waiting," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It told me to wait. I helped her upstairs, wrapped her in blankets, made her tea. She couldn't explain where she'd been for 2 days or how she'd gotten into our locked basement. The spare key was still in the kitchen drawer where it belonged. The basement door showed no signs of forced entry. She must have had a breakdown, I reasoned. Stress from her job, maybe. People don't just vanish and reappear without explanation. But now, standing in this kitchen with that infernal ticking surrounding me, I feel the same pull she must have felt. The same inexplicable certainty that something waits below. The sound seems to be coming from everywhere and nowhere. I press my ear to the wall, then to the floor. The refrigerator hums its usual tune. The dishwasher sits silent, yet the ticking continues with mechanical precision. Tick, tick, tick. Each beat feels synchronized with my pulse, or maybe my pulse has synchronized with it. I remember checking every clock in the house that day I found her. They were all working perfectly, all showing the correct time. But there had been something wrong with the grandfather clock in the hallway. It had stopped at exactly midnight. When I wound it again, it resumed its normal rhythm. But for those few seconds of silence before it restarted, I could have sworn I heard something else. A different kind of ticking, deeper, more organic. The basement door stands closed at the end of the hallway. I haven't been down there since that day. Neither has she, as far as I know. We never talked about what happened, not really. She went back to work, resumed her normal routine, and I convinced myself it was just a temporary break from reality. People have them. They recover. But the ticking knows better. My hands shake as I reach for the basement key. The metal feels ice cold against my palm, though the house is warm. As I insert it into the lock, I notice something that makes my breath catch. There are scratches around the keyhole, fresh ones. Thin, desperate marks, as if someone had been trying to unlock the door in darkness, fumbling with unsteady hands. The stairs creak under my weight, each step accompanied by that relentless ticking. It grows louder as I descend, more insistent. The basement smells different now, not just musty, but sweet in a way that makes my stomach turn, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. At the bottom of the stairs, I see it immediately. Where the old furnace used to be, someone has scratched marks into the concrete wall. Hundreds of tiny lines, grouped in sets of 4 with a diagonal slash through each group. Tally marks, as if someone had been counting days or hours or heartbeats. But that's impossible. The marks weren't there 3 weeks ago. I would have noticed them when I found her sitting in this exact spot. The ticking is loudest here, so loud it seems to vibrate through my bones. I press my palm against the wall where the marks are deepest and the concrete feels warm. Not just warm, it pulses, like living tissue beneath a thin skin of stone. I snatch my hand away, but the sensation lingers. My palm tingles with a rhythm that matches the ticking, matches my heartbeat, matches something else I can't quite identify but recognize nonetheless. Above me, I hear footsteps crossing the kitchen floor. Slow, deliberate steps that stop directly over where I stand. Then silence. Even the ticking pauses for a moment as if holding its breath. "Hello," I call up the stairs. No answer, but I know someone is there. I can feel their weight pressing down through the floorboards, can sense their presence like heat from a body standing too close. The footsteps resume, moving toward the basement door. I hear the handle turn, hear the hinges whisper as the door opens wider. Light from the hallway spills down the stairs, casting my shadow long and distorted across the basement floor. "I know you're down there," says a voice that sounds like mine but isn't quite right. The words are shaped differently, pronounced with a slight hesitation that I don't have. I turn toward the stairs, but the light seems wrong. It flickers like candlelight, though I know the hallway fixture is electric, and the shadow descending the steps doesn't match the footsteps I'm hearing. It moves too smoothly, like water flowing downward. "You found the marks," the voice continues. "It's definitely not mine now. It's my sister's voice, but speaking words I never heard her say. I've been making them for weeks, one for each time I come down here, one for each time I remember. But she's not here. She moved across the country right after the incident, took a new job, started fresh. We talk on the phone every few days. She's doing well, she says, sleeping better. The episodes have stopped." The shadow reaches the bottom of the stairs, but there's no body casting it. Just darkness shaped like a person, wavering in the unstable light. "Do you remember what really happened?" the shadow asks. "Not the story you told yourself, but what actually occurred." I want to run, but my legs feel rooted to the concrete floor. The ticking has become a thunderous drumbeat, drowning out my thoughts, making it impossible to think clearly. "I found you," I say aloud, though I'm not sure who I'm speaking to anymore. "You were sitting right here, confused, frightened. I helped you. I took care of you." The shadow tilts its head. "Are you sure about that? Are you sure about who found whom?" Suddenly the basement transforms. The walls seem to shift, becoming older, more weathered. The smell changes to less sweet, more metallic, and I'm not standing anymore. I'm sitting on the cold floor, knees drawn to my chest, staring at tally marks that seem to multiply before my eyes. How long have I been here? The question surfaces from somewhere deep in my mind, bringing with it a flood of sensations I don't want to acknowledge. Hunger, thirst, the ache of muscles held in one position for too long, the desperate need to mark another day, another hour, another heartbeat on the wall. But that's not what happened. I shake my head violently, trying to dispel the false memory. I was upstairs, I heard the ticking, I came down to investigate. Didn't I? The shadow moves closer, and now I can see its face, or rather, the absence of one. Where features should be, there's only a smooth darkness that reflects my own face back at me, distorted and unfamiliar. "The ticking," it says, "it's not coming from the walls, it's not coming from a clock, it's coming from you. It's been coming from you all along." I press my hands to my ears, but the sound doesn't diminish. If anything, it grows stronger, more urgent, and now I can feel it, the source of the rhythm. It's inside my chest, behind my ribs, where my heart should be beating steadily and slow. Instead, there's something else there, something mechanical and precise, counting down to a moment I can't remember but somehow know is coming. The basement flickers between two versions of itself. In one, I'm the concerned sibling, the rescuer, the one who found her and brought her back to safety. In the other, I'm the one who's been lost, marking time on concrete walls, listening to a heartbeat that doesn't quite belong to me anymore. Both versions feel equally real. Both versions feel equally false. Which one of us disappeared? I ask the shadow, but it's already fading, dissolving back into the uncertain light. The ticking continues, patient and eternal. Somewhere above me, footsteps cross the kitchen floor, and I wonder if they belong to someone searching for me, or if they're my own footsteps echoing from a timeline I can no longer trust. I look at my hands and see concrete dust under my fingernails, though I don't remember touching the wall. When I stand, my legs are stiff and sore, as if I've been sitting in one position for hours, or days, or weeks. The truth hovers just beyond my reach, like a word on the tip of my tongue that refuses to form. All I know for certain is the ticking, steady and relentless, marking time in a place where time itself has become unreliable. And somewhere in the darkness above or below or beside me, someone is still waiting. Story 4. Yellow afternoon light filtered through the heavy drapes, painting stripes on the worn carpet and dust motes suspended in the air. The grandfather clock, towering in the corner, stood silent, its hands frozen at a strange hour. The quiet tick-tock that had always marked the rhythm of days was conspicuously absent. A single chair lay overturned by the window, its cushions slightly torn, threadbare stuffing spilling out as if it had been pulled in a rush. The air felt dense, laden with a scent that didn't belong, a faint whiff of smoke, too recent and too close. As the quiet deepened, an unsettling truth seemed to press in, whispering that something vital had been disturbed. I knew what had happened here. The evidence was clear, methodical, almost textbook in its arrangement. My grandmother had fallen, simple as that. The overturned chair told the story perfectly. She'd been reaching for something on the high shelf, maybe the old photo album she kept there, or perhaps trying to wind that stubborn clock that had been losing time for months. The chair had given way beneath her, just as I'd warned her it would. Those rickety dining room chairs were decades old, their joints loose and unreliable. She'd hit her head on the corner of the mahogany side table. The paramedics confirmed what I already knew, a subdural hematoma, quick and merciful. At her age, these things happen. The house had been locked from the inside when I arrived with my spare key, just as expected. No signs of forced entry, nothing missing, everything exactly as she would have left it except for that one overturned chair and the silence where her presence used to be. The smoke smell was obvious too. She'd been burning old papers in the fireplace again, despite my repeated warnings about the chimney needing cleaning. I'd found the remnants there, charred fragments of what looked like correspondence, maybe old bills or letters she'd finally decided to clear out. She was always threatening to organize her paperwork, to get rid of the clutter that had accumulated over the decades. I stood in that familiar living room, breathing in the mustiness of old fabric and wood polish, and felt the weight of certainty. This was how it ended for people her age, not dramatically, not mysteriously, but with the simple physics of gravity and time. A moment of imbalance, a chair that couldn't bear the weight of ambition, a fall that changed everything in an instant. The funeral arrangements were straightforward. The house would need to be cleaned out, sorted through, prepared for sale. Life had a way of reducing itself to these practical matters, these lists of tasks that needed completion. I walked through each room, cataloging what would stay and what would go, feeling the strange comfort that comes with having answers, with understanding exactly what had transpired in these quiet spaces. But then I noticed the photographs. They were scattered on the floor near the overturned chair, face down, as if they'd been dropped rather than fallen. When I picked them up, my hands moved more slowly than they should have. These weren't the family photos I'd expected, the usual collection of birthdays and holidays that she kept on the mantel. These were older, stranger. Pictures of people I didn't recognize, taken in rooms that looked almost like this one, but somehow different. The furniture was arranged differently. The wallpaper was wrong. I turned one over and saw my grandmother's handwriting on the back, but the words made no sense. Just numbers and initials, like some kind of code. The date was impossible. It suggested the photo had been taken just weeks ago, but the people in it were wearing clothes from decades past, and the image quality had that sepia tone of much older photography. My certainty began to feel less solid, like standing on ground that looked stable until you realized it was shifting beneath your feet. I returned to the chair, examining it more carefully this time. The tear in the cushion wasn't random, it looked deliberate, as if someone had been searching for something hidden inside. The stuffing that had spilled out was mixed with small fragments of paper, torn so finely they were almost confetti. I gathered some of the larger pieces, trying to make out words or letters, but they'd been destroyed too thoroughly. The grandfather clock drew my attention again. Its silence felt different now, less like mechanical failure and more like intentional stopping. I opened the case and found the pendulum had been removed entirely. Not broken, not fallen, removed. The weights hung still and untouched, but someone had deliberately taken away the heart of the mechanism. I walked back to the fireplace and knelt beside the cold ashes. The burned papers weren't random correspondence after all. Among the charred remains, I could make out fragments of what looked like official documents. Parts of letterheads, pieces of signatures, the remnants of seals or stamps. These weren't old bills or personal letters. These were records of some kind, documents that someone had very deliberately destroyed. The smoke smell that had seemed so obvious earlier now felt different in my nostrils. It was too fresh, too recent. The ashes were still warm when I touched them, which meant the fire had been burning much more recently than the timeline I'd constructed. Maybe even after my grandmother had fallen, maybe even after she'd died. I sat back on my heels, staring at the fireplace, and felt the first real crack in my understanding. The sequence of events I'd been so certain about began to blur at the edges. If she'd fallen and hit her head, how had papers been burned afterward? If she'd been alone in the house, who had removed the pendulum from the clock? The afternoon light was fading now, and the stripes on the carpet had shifted, creating new patterns of shadow and illumination. I noticed things I'd missed before: a coffee cup on the side table that was still faintly warm, a newspaper folded to a specific page about estate laws and inheritance disputes. Small details that didn't fit the simple story I'd told myself about an elderly woman reaching for photo albums. I picked up the newspaper and read the article she'd been reading. It was about cases where family members had contested wills, situations where property disputes had turned ugly, where people had discovered that the relatives they trusted weren't who they seemed to be. Someone had underlined certain passages, made notes in the margins in handwriting that looked like my grandmother's, but somehow wasn't quite right. The photographs on the floor seemed to multiply as I looked at them again. There were dozens, maybe hundreds, all scattered in a pattern that suggested they'd been thrown rather than dropped. The faces in them were unfamiliar, but there was something about the eyes, the shape of the jawlines, that reminded me of family. Distant family, maybe. People I should recognize but didn't. I found myself questioning things I'd never thought to question before. How well had I really known my grandmother? We talked regularly, visited often, but our conversations had always stayed on the surface: health, weather, neighborhood gossip. I realized I knew almost nothing about her past, her relationships, the decades of life she'd lived before I was old enough to pay attention. The house itself seemed different now, as if I was seeing it for the first time. Rooms I'd played in as a child felt unfamiliar. Furniture seemed to have shifted position. Even the smell was wrong, not just the recent smoke, but something underneath, something that had been there so long I'd stopped noticing it until now. I went upstairs to her bedroom, moving more quietly than necessary, though I couldn't say why. The bed was made with military precision, exactly as she always kept it, but the closet door was open. Inside, clothes were pushed to one side, revealing a space behind them where something had been stored and recently removed. The dust pattern on the floor showed the outline of a box or suitcase, something substantial that was no longer there. Her dresser drawers were slightly open, each one just enough to suggest they'd been searched. Not ransacked, not obviously disturbed, but examined by someone who knew how to look without leaving obvious traces. The kind of searching that spoke of familiarity with the house, with her habits, with the places she might hide important things. I sat on the edge of her bed and tried to remember the last conversation we'd had. She'd called me just days earlier, but I couldn't recall what we'd talked about. The memory felt strangely absent, as if it had been deliberately erased from my mind. I remembered her voice sounding different, more urgent than usual, but I'd attributed it to her age, to the way elderly people sometimes got worked up over small things. Now I wondered what she'd been trying to tell me. The light outside was nearly gone, and the house was settling into evening shadows. I turned on lamps as I moved through the rooms, but the illumination only made the spaces feel more foreign. Every corner seemed to hold secrets I'd never noticed. Every piece of furniture seemed positioned to conceal rather than reveal. I found myself standing in the living room again, staring at that overturned chair. The certainty I'd felt earlier had completely evaporated, replaced by something much more unsettling. The scene no longer looked like the aftermath of a simple accident. It looked staged, arranged to tell a specific story to someone who wouldn't look too closely. But who had done the arranging, and why? The questions multiplied faster than I could process them. If my grandmother hadn't died from a fall, what had really happened to her? If someone else had been in the house, why had they gone to such trouble to make it look like an accident? What had been in those burned documents, and why were they important enough to destroy? More disturbing still, how well did I really know my own role in all of this? I'd arrived at the house with a key, but I couldn't clearly remember getting the call about her death. I'd spoken to paramedics, but their faces were blurry in my memory. I'd made funeral arrangements, but the details felt like they belonged to someone else's experience. The grandfather clock stood silent in its corner, its missing pendulum like a heart that had been surgically removed. Time had stopped in this house, but I was beginning to suspect it had stopped much earlier than I'd realized, and for reasons I was only beginning to understand. I looked at my hands and noticed they were shaking slightly. When had that started? There was dirt under my fingernails that I didn't remember getting, and my clothes smelled faintly of smoke, as if I'd been near the fireplace longer than I recalled. The photographs were still scattered on the floor, their faces staring up at me with expressions I couldn't read. Family members I should recognize but didn't. Scenes from a life that looked familiar but felt completely foreign. Evidence of connections I'd never known existed or had somehow forgotten. Outside, the neighborhood was settling into its evening routine. I could hear the distant sounds of normal life cars pulling into driveways, doors closing, televisions turning on. But inside this house, surrounded by the remnants of a life I'd thought I understood, I felt completely isolated from that ordinary world. The truth was somewhere in these rooms, hidden among the familiar objects that no longer seemed familiar. But I was beginning to suspect that finding it would require me to question not just what had happened to my grandmother, but who I really was in relation to her, and what role I might have played in the events that had led to this moment of terrible uncertainty. The yellow afternoon light was completely gone now, replaced by the harsh glare of electric bulbs that cast sharp shadows and revealed nothing. I stood in the center of the living room, surrounded by evidence I couldn't interpret, holding memories I couldn't trust, and wondering if the person I'd been when I walked into this house was the same person I was now. The silence was complete, but it no longer felt peaceful. It felt expectant, as if the house itself was waiting for me to understand something crucial, something that would change everything I thought I knew about my family, about my past, and about the very nature of the truth itself. Story 5. I assured them I hadn't stepped in, just hovered by the doorway, lingering in the hall until it was time to leave. The officers noted my words, turned their attention elsewhere, yet the stale air seemed to cling to my skin, a cloying reminder of an untouched space. My fingers carried a powdered residue as if they danced across an undisturbed surface. The faintest hum of a distant appliance buzzed, a low background murmur that pierced the quiet. My heart drummed a steady cadence, in rhythm with the blinking red light that pulsed silently on the device across the room. The silence enveloped me, feeling heavier with each breath, but the crease on the couch marked a different story. The weight of that lie sits in my stomach like swallowed glass. Even now, when I press my fingertips together, I feel the ghost of that powder. Talcum, maybe, or something finer. Something that shouldn't have been there if I'd truly remained in the hallway, watching from a distance as I claimed. Memory fractures, splinters into moments that refuse chronology. There was a cup on the kitchen counter, half full of something dark that had grown a skin across its surface. The ceramic handle pointed toward the window, and I remember thinking how deliberate that seemed, how purposeful. As if someone had positioned it just so, creating a line that drew the eye outward, toward the street where patrol cars would later gather with their rotating lights painting everything in alternating blue and red. But I wasn't supposed to know about the cup, wasn't supposed to have seen it from my position in the hall. The nausea comes in waves now, rolling through me like a tide that carries debris from deeper waters. Fragments of sensation that don't belong together. The smell of vanilla candles mixed with something medicinal. The sound of a television murmuring in another room. Voices discussing weather patterns and traffic conditions as if the world continued its normal rotation. I keep returning to the couch, that depression in the cushions where someone had been sitting. The fabric still held the impression of weight, of presence. But when I close my eyes and try to reconstruct the scene, the details shift. Sometimes the crease runs diagonally as if someone had been lying down. Other times it's perfectly centered, suggesting they'd sat upright, perhaps watching that blinking red light I mentioned to the officers. The device, what was it? A smoke detector with a dying battery, some kind of recording equipment. The memory slides away when I try to focus on it directly, like trying to look at something in peripheral vision that vanishes the moment you turn your head. My hands were clean when the police arrived. I remember checking them compulsively, turning my palms up toward the fluorescent lights in the hallway while voices echoed from inside the apartment. Clean except for that residue. That fine coating that felt like silk between my thumb and forefinger. There had been a conversation earlier, voices raised but not quite shouting. The kind of argument that happens behind closed doors where the participants are conscious of neighbors, of thin walls and shared ventilation systems that carry sound. I'd been in my own apartment then, definitely in my own space, listening through the common wall we shared. Or had I been in the hallway already? The timeline blurs, events folding into each other like playing cards shuffled by unsteady hands. The woman who lived there had a habit of leaving her door unlocked. I knew this because packages were sometimes delivered to the wrong address, and she told me once to just walk in and leave them on her table if she wasn't home. A casual intimacy between neighbors that seemed normal at the time, but now feels loaded with significance I can't quite grasp. Her laugh had a particular quality, not unpleasant but distinctive. It would carry through the walls at odd hours, sometimes accompanied by the sound of a television or music, other times occurring in apparent silence, as if she were laughing at her own thoughts. I hadn't heard that laugh in several periods before the day the police came. The officers asked routine questions. When had I last seen her? Did I notice anything unusual, any strange visitors or sounds? I answered honestly, or thought I did, but honesty becomes complicated when your own memories feel unreliable, when the sequence of events seems to rearrange itself each time you examine it. I told them about the unlocked door, about her casual invitation to enter when delivering packages. They made notes, asked if I'd ever taken her up on that invitation. No, I said, never. But my fingers remembered the texture of that powder, and my eyes held the image of the cup with its deliberate positioning, and somewhere in the back of my mind, I could still hear the hum of that appliance, could still see the rhythmic pulse of that red light. The apartment had felt different that day, the air thicker, charged with the kind of tension that precedes thunderstorms. I'd been restless in my own space, unable to concentrate on the book I'd been reading, unable to settle into any comfortable position on my own couch. The walls seemed too close, the ceiling too low. I needed air, needed movement. The hallway had provided some relief, neutral territory between the claustrophobia of my apartment and the complexity of the world beyond the building. I'd stood there, breathing more easily, when I noticed her door was ajar, not wide open, just slightly separated from the frame, creating a gap narrow enough that it might have been accidental. I should have knocked, should have called out to make sure everything was all right. Instead, I found myself listening, straining to hear some indication of normal activity within. The hum of the appliance, the distant television, but no movement, no footsteps, no human sounds. The red light was visible through the gap, blinking with mechanical persistence, counting out seconds or minutes or some other measurement I couldn't decipher. Hypnotic in its regularity, like a heartbeat or a metronome keeping time for a song no one was playing. How long did I stand there? Long enough for my legs to grow stiff, for the muscles in my neck to develop a persistent ache from holding my head at an angle that allowed me to peer through the gap without appearing to do so. Long enough for doubt to creep in, for the voice in my head to suggest that standing in a hallway staring at someone else's partially open door was not normal behavior. But I didn't step inside, I'm certain of that, almost certain. The powder could have come from anywhere, could have been on the door frame, transferred when I steadied myself with one hand while listening. Could have been floating in the air, settling on exposed surfaces the way dust settles, invisible until you run your fingers across it and feel the fine grit that accumulates in all the spaces we don't think to clean. The crease in the couch, though, that's harder to explain away. Physical evidence of presence, of weight applied and then removed. The fabric held the impression like a photograph, capturing a moment in 3 dimensions. I think about that impression often now, wonder about the person who made it, about their final moments in that familiar space. Were they comfortable? Were they afraid? Did they see the red light blinking, hear the appliance humming its low mechanical song? The officers finished their investigation eventually, ruled it natural causes, I heard later from another neighbor. Heart failure, sudden and complete. She'd been alone, which explained the delay in discovery, the way the apartment had remained undisturbed until someone finally noticed the accumulation of mail, the missed appointments, the absence of those distinctive laughs that used to carry through the walls. Natural causes, a phrase that should provide closure but somehow doesn't. Natural suggests inevitability, the body following its predetermined course toward failure. But there was nothing that felt natural about that day, about the charged atmosphere and the unlocked door, and the way the cup sat positioned on the counter like a signpost pointing toward something I couldn't see. I've tried to reconstruct the timeline to place events in their proper sequence, but memory resists chronology, insists on presenting moments in order of emotional intensity rather than temporal accuracy. The red light comes first, always, followed by the powder on my fingers, then the crease in the couch, then the cup with its skin of congealed liquid. The conversation I overheard or thought I overheard fits somewhere in the sequence, but I can never pin down exactly when. Voices raised in frustration or fear, then suddenly quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that feels expectant, as if the world is holding its breath waiting for something to resume. But maybe there was no conversation. Maybe the voices belonged to the television, to characters in some drama playing out their scripted conflicts while she sat on the couch, pressing that distinctive crease into the fabric, watching the red light blink and listening to the appliance hum. The powder bothers me most. Its presence on my fingers suggests contact, suggests I touched something I shouldn't have touched, crossed some boundary I claimed not to have crossed. But what surface could have held such a fine coating? What object would have been dusted with something so delicate it felt like silk? I wash my hands compulsively now, scrubbing until the skin grows raw and sensitive. But the memory of that texture remains, phantom sensation that returns whenever I'm not actively thinking about something else. A reminder that some boundaries, once crossed, leave permanent traces. The building feels different now, quieter but not peacefully so. The silence has weight, has presence. It presses against the walls and seeps through the ventilation system, carrying with it the absence of that laugh, the absence of footsteps and closing doors and all the small sounds that indicate life continuing its normal patterns. I find myself standing in the hallway more often than I should, listening for sounds that don't come, watching for movement behind doors that remain closed. The other neighbors nod when they pass, offer brief acknowledgments of shared loss, shared disruption of routine. But their eyes hold questions they don't ask, observations they don't voice. They know I found her, or rather that I was present when she was found, when the police arrived and the paramedics wheeled out their equipment, and the building filled with official voices discussing procedures and protocols. They know I was the one who answered questions, who provided what little information I could about her habits and routines. But do they know about the powder, about the crease in the couch, about the way the red light continued blinking even after everything else had stopped? The device was removed eventually, along with other personal effects that held no significance to anyone except the woman who had lived with them. The apartment was cleaned, repainted, prepared for new occupancy, but I can still see that light in my mind, still hear the appliance humming its mechanical song. Sometimes I wonder if the new tenant will hear it too, will stand in their own space and notice sounds that don't quite belong, will feel the weight of presence in rooms that should be empty. Will they find powder on surfaces that appear clean, impressions in furniture that should be unmarked? Or maybe the disturbance was specific to me, to my particular sensitivity to boundaries crossed and truths left unspoken. Maybe the apartment holds no traces now, no evidence of the day when natural causes claimed a life, and I stood in a hallway claiming innocence while my fingers held proof of contact I couldn't explain. The investigation is closed, the case, if it ever was a case, resolved to everyone's satisfaction except mine. Natural causes provide a neat conclusion, a way to file away questions that have no comfortable answers. but I remain unsettled, haunted by details that don't align, by memories that shift when examined too closely. I assured them I hadn't stepped in. The words echo now, taking on new weight with each repetition. A statement of fact or a desperate assertion of innocence. The distinction matters less than the residue it left behind, the powder on my fingers and the crease in the couch and the red light that continues blinking in a room that no longer exists, in a memory that refuses to stay fixed. The truth, whatever it is, lives in the spaces between certainty and doubt, between what I remember and what I claim to remember. It pulses like that red light, keeping time for a song that only I can hear, marking moments that belong to no official timeline but continue to unfold in the theater of my restless mind. Story 6. The radio hummed softly in the corner, its static a gentle reminder of the outside world. Dust motes floated lazily through the afternoon sun streaming in from the window, giving the room a tranquil, timeless quality. Yet in the stillness, the tick of the grandfather clock was conspicuously absent. On the mantel, an ornate key lay unused, its presence a silent question. The air felt charged, as if waiting for an uninvited whisper to disrupt the poised quiet. I keep touching the key. My fingers know its weight now, the way the metal warms under my skin. She left it there, or I put it there. Memory shifts like sand. The first time I noticed the smell, I thought it was the neighbor's garden. Something sweet and wrong, like fruit left too long in the sun. But gardens don't smell like that through closed windows. Gardens don't make you check the locks twice before bed. Her coffee cup sits on the kitchen counter, still there. The ring of brown stain at the bottom has dried to a perfect circle. I've washed it 3 times, but somehow it returns to that same spot, always with that same stain, as if she just stepped away. I found the photographs under the floorboard in the basement, not hidden exactly, more like forgotten, or placed there by someone who knew I would look. My face appears in several of them, taken from angles I don't remember posing for, through windows, across streets, in the grocery store. The detective asked if I felt watched, such a strange question. We're all watched, aren't we? By neighbors, by strangers, by the parts of ourselves we pretend don't exist. But his eyes lingered on my hands when he asked. I realized I was scratching at my palms. She used to hum while doing dishes. The same melody always. I catch myself humming it now, though I never learned the words. Sometimes I hear it coming from upstairs when I know the house is empty. Sometimes I realize it's coming from me. The key unlocks the clock. I discovered this by accident or maybe by design. Inside, where the pendulum should swing, there's a space just large enough for a small box. The box contains letters I never wrote, addressed to people I've never met, but the handwriting looks familiar. I've been having the same conversation with her for weeks now. She sits in the blue chair by the window, light streaming through her hair, and we discuss ordinary things. The weather, what to have for dinner, whether the mailman seems different lately. It feels so natural that I forget she isn't there until I offer her tea and pour 2 cups. The police found nothing unusual about the house, nothing unusual about me. Their report used words like cooperative and forthcoming. But I saw the way they looked at the basement door, the way they tested the lock on the clock, the way they asked about the photographs as if they already knew the answers. Blood washes out easier than people think, especially from wood floors if you catch it quickly. I learned this from a television program, or maybe from experience. The distinction blurs when you're scrubbing on your hands and knees at midnight, wondering whose blood you're cleaning. She visits me in dreams now, or what I think are dreams. We walk through rooms that don't exist in the house, discussing things that haven't happened yet. She shows me where she hid the spare key, points out the loose floorboard, explains why the clock stopped working. I wake with dirt under my fingernails. The neighbors have started crossing the street when they see me, not obviously, just subtle course corrections, sudden interests in shop windows, phone calls that require immediate attention. But I notice. I've always been good at noticing. I keep finding notes in my own handwriting that I don't remember writing, shopping lists for items I don't eat, appointments with doctors I've never seen, phone numbers that ring to empty houses. The paper always smells faintly of her perfume. The basement door was painted recently. Fresh white paint over what might have been stains, or might have been shadows, or might have been nothing at all. My hands remember holding the brush, but my mind recalls watching someone else do the painting. Both memories feel equally true. I've started sleeping in the blue chair by the window. The bed feels too large now, too empty, though I lived alone for years before she came. The chair cradles me just right, and sometimes I wake to find a blanket I don't remember pulling over myself. The detective called again. He wants to know about the photographs, about the timing, about why I waited so long to report anything unusual. But what would I report? That I talk to empty chairs, that I clean blood I'm not sure exists, that I dream in someone else's memories. She's been gone for weeks now, or maybe months. Time moves strangely in this house, pooling in corners like spilled water. The calendar on the kitchen wall shows the same date every day, though I'm certain I've been turning the pages. I found her journal hidden behind the false back of the medicine cabinet, page after page of observations about me. My habits, my routines, my fears, written in her careful script, but describing things she couldn't have known, things I've never told anyone, things I've barely admitted to myself. The key grows heavier each time I hold it, as if it's absorbing something from the air, from my touch, from the secrets it unlocks. Sometimes I think I should throw it away, but it always finds its way back to the mantel. The radio plays the same song every afternoon at the same time. A song about lost love and empty houses and the spaces between what we know and what we fear. I've never heard it anywhere else, though the melody haunts me like something from childhood. I keep the photographs in a shoebox now, arranged by date, though none of them are dated. The progression tells a story I'm not sure I want to understand. My face changes from picture to picture, growing more hollow, more watchful, more like someone I don't recognize. The floorboard in the basement has warped from moisture. It creaks when I step on it, a sound like a small animal in distress. Underneath, the earth is soft and dark, rich, as if something has been feeding it. She's standing in the kitchen again, her back to me, washing the same cup over and over. Her humming drifts through the house like smoke, settling into corners I can't reach. When I blink, she's gone, but the water is still running. Story 7. Every morning, the old clock on the mantel chimed exactly at 7:00 with a gentle predictability that was comforting in its precision. I never paid it much attention. It was just part of the backdrop of life, its ticking a quiet reassurance. But last Tuesday, it chimed at 7:02, a small deviation, almost unnoticeable unless you were listening. The next day it was 7:03. This afternoon the chime came a full 5 minutes late. I've checked the hands, adjusted the gears, yet now it's eerily silent and the tick isn't quite right. The silence crawls under my skin like cold water. There's something wrong with the quiet, something that makes my chest tight and my fingers restless. I keep touching the clock's face, running my thumb across the glass, feeling for cracks that aren't there. The metal is warm, warmer than it should be. I remember hands, not mine, smaller hands with chipped nail polish the color of dried blood, They were reaching for something, always reaching. The memory surfaces without context, floating in the space between sleep and waking. Those hands belonged to someone who used to wind this clock every evening, a ritual performed with the devotion of prayer. She had a way of tilting her head when she concentrated, like a bird listening for worms in the soil. I can see that tilt now, the way her hair fell across her cheek, obscuring her expression. But when I try to focus on her face, it dissolves into fragments, a smile that never quite reached her eyes, a laugh that came too quickly, too sharp. The house feels different without the clock's heartbeat. Rooms that once felt familiar now seem to hold their breath. I walk through them, my footsteps echoing in ways they never did before. The floorboards creak in new places, or maybe I'm just listening differently now. Maybe I'm finally hearing what was always there. There was a conversation in the kitchen. I remember the steam rising from 2 cups of coffee, how it twisted in the air between us like smoke signals. She was saying something about time, about how it moves differently for different people. Her voice had that quality it got when she was trying to explain something important, something she needed me to understand. Time isn't linear, she said, stirring sugar into her cup with mechanical precision. It pools and eddies, sometimes it stops altogether. I thought she was being philosophical, the way she sometimes got after reading those books with worn spines and highlighted passages. I nodded and made appropriate sounds, but I wasn't really listening. I was watching the way the light caught the steam, how it seemed to form shapes before dissolving. Now I wonder if she was trying to tell me something else entirely. The clock face stares at me with its painted numbers, each one slightly faded from years of observation. The hands point to different positions every time I look, though I never see them move. It's as if time itself has become unstuck in this room, flowing backward and forward without regard for sequence or sense. I remember finding her in the living room, sitting in the chair that faced the mantel. She was perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the clock. I spoke her name, but she didn't respond. For a moment I thought she might be sleeping with her eyes open, something she claimed was impossible, but which I'd always suspected she could do. When I touched her shoulder, she startled as if waking from a deep dream. Her eyes found mine, but there was something distant in them, something that made me take a step back. "It stopped," she said, though the clock was still ticking. "What stopped?" "Everything." The memory has edges that don't align properly, like a photograph that's been torn and taped back together. I remember the weight of her gaze, the way it seemed to see through me to something beyond. But I can't remember what I said in response, or how the conversation ended, or even if it was a conversation at all. Sometimes I think it might have been a dream. The silence in the house has texture now, thick and oppressive. It presses against my eardrums until I hear phantom sounds, footsteps in empty rooms, doors closing when no one is there, the whisper of fabric against skin. I find myself holding my breath, listening for something I can't name. There are photographs on the mantel beside the clock, their frames slightly askew. I straighten them compulsively, but they always seem to drift back to their original positions. The faces in the pictures smile with the frozen enthusiasm of captured moments, but their eyes follow me as I move through the room. One photograph shows 2 figures standing beside a car, their faces partially obscured by shadow and the passage of time. I know I'm one of them, but I can't always remember which one. The other figure seems to shift and change depending on the angle of light, sometimes familiar, sometimes completely foreign. I remember driving somewhere, the radio playing static between stations. She was in the passenger seat, her fingers drumming against the window in a rhythm that didn't match the music. We were going to see someone, or maybe we were running from someone. The destination felt both urgent and inevitable, like the end of a sentence you know is coming but can't quite predict. The road stretched ahead of us, empty and straight, lined with trees that seemed to lean inward as we passed. I kept checking the rearview mirror, though I couldn't say what I was looking for. The sky had that quality it gets before storms, heavy and electric with possibility. "We should turn back," she said without turning from the window. "We're almost there. That's what I'm afraid of." But we didn't turn back. We never turned back, even when we should have. Even when the signs were clear and the path was obviously wrong, we kept moving forward with the stubborn momentum of objects in motion. The clock's silence is becoming unbearable. I wind it again, though I wound it this morning and the day before that. The key turns easily, too easily, as if there's nothing inside to resist. The mechanism should be tight, should require effort, but it spins freely in my fingers like a toy that's lost its purpose. I remember winding it for her when her hands began to shake. It was a small thing, barely noticeable at first. A tremor when she reached for her coffee cup, a slight uncertainty when she buttoned her coat. But gradually it became more pronounced, more constant, until even simple tasks required careful concentration. She never complained about it, never acknowledged the change. She simply adapted, finding new ways to accomplish old routines. When she could no longer wind the clock herself, she would sit and watch me do it, offering guidance that grew more specific and urgent with each passing day. "3 full turns, no more," she would say. "Too much tension and something breaks." I followed her instructions precisely, but now I wonder if I misunderstood something crucial. Maybe the breaking was inevitable. Maybe it had already happened, and we were just going through the motions of maintenance on something that was already beyond repair. The house settles around me with small creaks and sighs, the sounds of wood and metal adjusting to temperature changes I can't feel. But there's something else in the settling, a rhythm that almost matches the missing tick of the clock. It's as if the house itself is trying to keep time, compensating for the silence with its own improvised heartbeat. I find myself in the basement without remembering the decision to go there. The stairs feel unfamiliar under my feet, though I must have climbed them thousands of times. The walls seem closer together than they should be, and the ceiling lower. Everything is covered in a fine layer of dust that shouldn't be there, shouldn't have accumulated so quickly. There are boxes stacked against the far wall, their contents labeled in handwriting I recognize but can't quite place. The words seem to shift when I'm not looking directly at them, rearranging themselves into new configurations that make less sense than the original. One box is open, its contents spilled across the concrete floor. Photographs, documents, small objects wrapped in tissue paper. I kneel beside them, trying to understand the logic of their arrangement. They seem to tell a story, but it's a story with missing chapters, crucial scenes left out or deliberately obscured. A photograph catches my attention, 2 people standing in what might be this very basement, though the walls look different, newer somehow. They're smiling, but their posture suggests tension, as if they're posing for a picture they don't want taken. Behind them, barely visible in the background, is a shape that might be furniture covered with sheets. I don't remember taking this photograph. I don't remember being in this photograph, but the evidence is there in my hands, undeniable and inexplicable. The clock upstairs chimes once, though it has no reason to chime. The sound travels through the floorboards and into my bones, a vibration that feels more like memory than actual sound. I count the seconds that follow, but they don't add up to anything meaningful. When I return to the living room, the clock's hands have moved again. They point to positions that correspond to no actual time, creating angles that hurt to look at directly. The face seems larger than before, or maybe I'm standing closer to it than I intended. I remember her final instructions about the clock, delivered with an urgency that seemed disproportionate to the task. She made me repeat them back to her 3 times, as if my understanding was crucial to some larger plan. When it stops, she said, don't try to fix it immediately. Let it rest. Sometimes things need to stop before they can start again properly. At the time, I thought she was talking about the clock. Now I'm not so sure. The room fills with shadows that don't correspond to any visible light source. They move independently, flowing across the walls like dark water. I watch them gather around the clock, forming shapes that almost resolve into recognizable forms before dissolving back into formless motion. There's something I'm not remembering, something important that hovers at the edge of consciousness like a word on the tip of my tongue. It has to do with the clock, with her, with the way time seems to behave differently in this house. But every time I reach for it, it slips away, leaving only the taste of copper and the sound of silence where ticking should be. I close my eyes and try to reconstruct the sequence of events that led to this moment, but the events refuse to arrange themselves chronologically. They exist as isolated incidents, connected by emotion rather than logic, by association rather than causation. The clock chimes again, a sound that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. When I open my eyes, the hands are pointing directly at me, as if the clock has become a compass and I am its magnetic north. In the growing darkness, I understand that some questions are more dangerous than their answers. Some silences are more revealing than any sound, and some clocks are meant to stop, not because they're broken, but because time itself has reached a conclusion that defies measurement. The house breathes around me, patient and knowing. The clock waits, its face reflecting light that isn't there, its hands pointing toward a truth I'm not sure I want to discover. And in the space between seconds, between heartbeats, between the tick that was and the talk that might never come, I finally begin to remember what I've been trying so hard to forget. Story 8. It wasn't the first time the windows were left open during the night. The curtains moved with the breeze, brushing against the sill like lazy fingers tapping a rhythm. I noticed the thin layer of dust on the windowsill was disturbed, but I didn't give it much thought. The floor was as cold as it always was in the early morning, unyielding beneath my feet. The pictures on the wall hadn't changed, though one frame hung slightly off-center. I straightened it out of habit, without considering what might have changed. It seemed unnecessary to mention anything later. I left the windows open. The coffee mug sits on the kitchen counter exactly where I remember placing it the night before. White ceramic with a hairline crack running from the handle to the rim, a flaw that developed gradually over months of use. The stain inside has darkened to the color of old pennies, despite my attempts to scrub it clean. When I lift the mug to my lips, the coffee tastes different than usual, carrying an undertone I cannot identify. Perhaps the beans have gone stale, or perhaps my sense of taste has shifted overnight. The liquid leaves a metallic aftertaste that lingers long after I set the mug down. The morning newspaper lies folded on the front porch, wrapped in plastic that glistens with dew. The delivery person has been remarkably consistent lately, arriving at precisely the same time each day. I can hear the soft thud of the paper hitting the wooden boards from my bedroom window, a sound that has become as reliable as clockwork. Yet today the plastic wrapper bears tiny puncture marks, as if small teeth had tested its surface. The paper inside remains dry and intact, but the holes trouble me in a way I cannot articulate. My neighbor's garden gnome has shifted position again. Yesterday it faced the street with its painted smile directed toward passing cars. This morning it stares directly at my kitchen window, its ceramic eyes seeming to track my movements as I prepare breakfast. The gnome's red cap appears more vivid than before, as if someone had touched up the paint during the night. I tell myself that wind or settling soil could cause such movements, but the gnome sits on level concrete, and the night was still except for that gentle breeze through my open windows. The telephone rings at odd intervals throughout the day. When I answer, silence greets me, followed by the soft sound of breathing that might be my own echo. The calls never last more than 10 seconds before the line goes dead. The caller identification display shows only a string of zeros, which the phone company claims indicates a technical malfunction. I have grown accustomed to these interruptions, though they seem to occur more frequently when I am alone in the house. The basement door handle feels warm to the touch, despite the cool temperature of the house. The brass has developed a patina over the years, but recently it gleams in certain spots where hands might naturally grip. I rarely venture into the basement except to check the furnace or retrieve stored items, yet the handle suggests frequent use. The wood around the lock shows fresh scratches, thin lines that catch the light when I examine them closely. Perhaps the house is settling, causing the door to stick and requiring force to open. My bedroom slippers have accumulated dirt on their soles, though I wear them only indoors. The pattern pressed into the fabric matches the texture of outdoor soil, complete with small pebbles embedded in the weave. I must have stepped outside briefly and forgotten, perhaps to retrieve the newspaper or check the mailbox. Memory can be unreliable in the early morning hours, when the mind has not yet fully awakened from sleep. I brush the dirt away and place the slippers beside my bed. The mirror in the hallway reflects the staircase behind me, but sometimes I glimpse movement in its surface when the house should be empty. A shadow crossing from one room to another, or the suggestion of a figure pausing at the top of the stairs. When I turn to look directly, nothing appears out of place. The mirror itself shows signs of age, with silver backing that has begun to deteriorate around the edges, creating dark spots that might explain these phantom images. My car keys hang on their designated hook by the front door, but they feel lighter than usual when I lift them. The metal has warmed from room temperature to something approaching body heat, as if they had been carried in someone's pocket. The mileage on the odometer has increased by 3 miles since yesterday, though I have no memory of driving anywhere. Perhaps I took a short trip to clear my mind and the memory has faded, the way dreams disappear upon waking. The kitchen faucet drips with mechanical precision, one drop every 15 seconds. I have tightened the handle repeatedly, but the dripping persists. The sound echoes through the quiet house, marking time like a metronome. Each drop strikes the stainless steel sink with a tiny ping that seems louder in the darkness. I have grown to anticipate each sound, counting the intervals between drops until the rhythm becomes hypnotic. The mail arrives later than usual, and the envelopes show signs of having been opened and carefully resealed. The adhesive on the flaps has lost its original tackiness, requiring only gentle pressure to lift. The contents appear untouched, but the papers inside feel different, as if they had been handled by unfamiliar fingers. The postal worker claims no knowledge of any irregularities, suggesting that temperature changes might affect the adhesive. The floorboards in the upstairs hallway creak in a specific sequence when walked upon. I have memorized the pattern over years of living in this house, knowing exactly where to step to minimize noise. Yet sometimes I hear that familiar sequence of creaks when I am sitting downstairs, as if someone else has learned the same careful choreography. The sounds always stop when I pause to listen more intently. My reading glasses rest on the nightstand where I left them, but the lenses have been cleaned to a shine that surpasses my usual casual maintenance. The cloth I use for cleaning remains in the bathroom medicine cabinet, dry and folded. Perhaps I cleaned them and forgot, or perhaps the cleaning lady visited on a different day than scheduled. The frames feel slightly warm, as if they had been worn recently. The thermostat displays a temperature 2 degrees higher than I remember setting it. The digital readout glows steadily, showing no signs of malfunction. I adjust it back to my preferred setting, but by evening it has crept upward again. The heating system responds normally to manual adjustments, yet something continues to alter the programmed temperature. The service technician finds no mechanical problems during his inspection. The shower drain catches more hair than seems reasonable for one person. Long strands in colors that do not quite match my own, though the difference is subtle enough to attribute to lighting conditions or seasonal changes. The hair feels coarser than mine, with a texture that reminds me of someone I once knew but cannot clearly remember. I clear the drain regularly, but the accumulation continues. The grocery list on my refrigerator includes items written in handwriting that resembles mine, but contains small variations in letter formation. The ink appears fresh, though I have no memory of adding these particular items. The additions are practical choices that I might reasonably make, foods that complement my usual purchases. Perhaps I wrote them during a distracted moment when my attention was divided between multiple tasks. The living room furniture has shifted slightly from its usual arrangement. The sofa sits 6 inches farther from the wall, and the coffee table has rotated a few degrees clockwise. The changes are subtle enough to escape immediate notice, becoming apparent only when I try to navigate familiar pathways in the darkness. The carpet shows compressed areas where the furniture legs previously rested, confirming that movement has occurred. The front door lock requires more effort to turn than it once did. The key catches slightly before engaging, as if the internal mechanism has been altered or worn. A locksmith examines the hardware and finds it in good working order, though he notes that the key shows unusual wear patterns. He suggests that temperature fluctuations might cause the metal to expand and contract, affecting the fit. My coffee cup sits empty beside my chair, though I have no memory of finishing the contents. The ceramic retains warmth, suggesting recent use. A lipstick mark on the rim catches my attention, though I rarely wear makeup at home. The color is close to my natural lip tone, making it difficult to determine whether the mark is cosmetic or simply a trick of the light on damp ceramic. The photograph on my desk has developed a crack across the glass, running diagonally from corner to corner. The image beneath remains intact, but the fracture distorts the faces in subtle ways. I cannot recall any impact that might have caused the damage. The frame appears solid, with no signs of having been dropped or struck. Perhaps age has made the glass brittle, susceptible to stress from temperature changes. The silence in the house carries weight, pressing against my ears like water at depth. Even the familiar sounds seem muffled, as if filtered through some invisible barrier. The refrigerator's hum, the clock's ticking, the settling of wooden beams all reach me from a distance. Sometimes I catch myself holding my breath, listening for sounds that exist just beyond the threshold of perception. The curtains hang differently than before, their folds creating new patterns of shadow and light. The fabric appears heavier, as if it has absorbed moisture from the night air. When I touch the material, it feels damp despite the absence of rain. The dampness carries a scent I cannot identify, something organic and slightly sweet, like flowers left too long in water. My reflection in the bathroom mirror seems delayed, lagging behind my movements by a fraction of a second. When I raise my hand, the mirrored image follows a heartbeat later. The delay is so brief that I question whether I am imagining it, yet it occurs consistently each morning. The mirror's surface shows no obvious flaws that might cause such an effect. The kitchen window overlooks the backyard where nothing appears to have changed. The grass grows at its usual pace, the trees sway gently in the breeze, and birds visit the feeder with regular frequency. Yet something in the scene feels different, as if I am viewing it through a filter that subtly alters colors and textures. The familiar landscape has become foreign, though I cannot pinpoint exactly what has changed. Story 9. I had been frozen in place, watching the curtains sway slightly in a room with no breeze. The house settled around me, the wood groaning in quiet protest, though the air remained oppressively still. The floor beneath my feet felt uneven, a disquieting tilt that shouldn't have been there. Outside, branches whispered secrets against the windows, but inside, the silence clawed at my senses. Each second stretched, held captive by an atmosphere that refused to yield its secrets. Then a chilling change, a faint, unfamiliar scratch at the door, an invitation or a warning, but not a sound it should have made. The sound came again, deliberate and measured. 3 scratches, pause, 3 more. I remember thinking how methodical it seemed, almost like a code. My sister had always been dramatic about these things, claiming she could sense when something was wrong with the old place. But this was different. This was real. I approached the front door slowly, my bare feet silent against the hardwood. The brass handle felt cold under my palm, colder than it should have been considering the late afternoon warmth that had filled the house just hours before. When I opened it, nobody was there. Just the empty porch with its peeling white paint and the swing that hung motionless despite the wind I could hear stirring the trees beyond. That's when I noticed the envelope. It was tucked between the screen door and the frame, cream-colored paper with my name written in careful block letters. No return address, no postmark. The handwriting looked familiar, though I couldn't place it immediately. Inside was a single photograph and a brief note that read, "You need to remember what really happened that night." The photograph showed the interior of this very house, but wrong somehow. The furniture was arranged differently, and there were people in the frame I didn't recognize. A woman with dark hair sitting on our couch, a man standing by the window with his back turned. The lighting was strange too, casting shadows that seemed to reach toward the camera. I studied the image until my eyes watered, trying to make sense of it. The logical explanation came easily enough. Someone was playing a prank, probably one of my sister's friends who had access to old photos from before we inherited the place. She'd mentioned that the previous owners had left boxes of personal items in the basement. Someone must have found them, doctored the image somehow, and decided to mess with my head. But even as I constructed this rational narrative, something nagged at me. The woman in the photograph wore a dress I remembered owning, one I'd donated months ago, and the man by the window stood exactly where I'd been standing just moments before, in the same posture, with the same slight tilt of his head. I walked back inside, leaving the door open to let in some air. The house felt stifling now, as if the walls were holding their breath. I placed the photograph on the kitchen counter and stared at it while I made coffee, trying to shake the feeling that the people in the image were staring back. The coffee tasted wrong, bitter in a way that reminded me of medicine, though I'd used the same beans I always did. I poured it down the sink and noticed my hands were trembling slightly. Stress, I told myself. The move, the new job, the isolation of living alone for the first time in years. All perfectly reasonable explanations for feeling unsettled. I decided to call my sister, but when I picked up the phone, there was no dial tone. The line was dead, or maybe just quiet in a way that suggested someone else was listening. I hung up quickly and checked my cell phone instead. No signal, which was odd because I'd had full bars all morning. The afternoon light began to fade earlier than expected, casting long shadows across the living room floor. I turned on the lamps, but they seemed dimmer than usual, creating pools of weak yellow light that barely pushed back the gathering darkness. The photograph on the counter seemed to glow in the artificial light, drawing my attention again and again. That's when I started to notice other things. The coffee cup I'd used was back on the counter, clean and dry, though I distinctly remembered leaving it in the sink. The curtains in the living room were drawn closed, though I was certain I'd left them open to catch the breeze that never came. Small changes, easily explained by forgetfulness or fatigue, but they accumulated like drops of water wearing away at stone. I found myself walking through the house, checking rooms I hadn't entered all day. In the spare bedroom, the bed was made with military precision, corners tucked tight and pillows fluffed. I never made beds that way, had never learned how. But my hands seemed to know the technique as I ran my fingers along the crisp edges of the sheets. The basement door stood slightly ajar, though I kept it locked out of habit. The previous owners had left it full of their belongings, and I hadn't worked up the courage to sort through everything yet. Now, peering down the wooden steps into the darkness below, I caught the scent of something familiar. Lavender soap and cigarette smoke, a combination that made my chest tighten with an emotion I couldn't name. I flicked the light switch, but nothing happened. The bulb must have burned out, though I could have sworn it worked the last time I checked. I used my phone's flashlight instead, the weak beam barely illuminating the cluttered space below. Boxes stacked against the walls, old furniture draped in sheets, the detritus of lives lived and abandoned. But there, in the center of the concrete floor, was a clear space I didn't remember seeing before. The dust had been disturbed, swept away in a rough circle about 6 feet across. And in that circle, barely visible in the phone's dim light, were dark stains that looked suspiciously like they might once have been red. My rational mind kicked in immediately. Water damage, rust from old pipes, spilled paint from some long-ago renovation project. The basement was old, full of stains and marks that could mean anything or nothing. But my body reacted differently, flooding with adrenaline as if recognizing danger my conscious mind couldn't process. I backed up the stairs quickly, nearly tripping in my haste to get away from whatever I'd seen or imagined down there. The photograph on the kitchen counter seemed to be waiting for me, and this time I noticed details I'd missed before. The woman on the couch wasn't just sitting casually. Her posture was rigid, uncomfortable, as if she were afraid to move. And the man by the window wasn't looking outside at all. In the reflection on the glass, barely visible but unmistakably there, his eyes were fixed on something behind the camera. On me. The realization hit like a physical blow, though it made no logical sense. I wasn't in the photograph, couldn't be in the photograph because I was the one looking at it. But the reflected gaze in the window glass was definitely focused on my position, and the woman's rigid posture suddenly looked less like casual sitting and more like someone trying very hard to appear normal while being watched. I turned the photograph over, hoping to find some clue about when and where it was taken. Instead, I found another note, this one in different handwriting. The basement remembers what you forgot. The words seemed to pulse on the paper, growing larger and smaller with each heartbeat. I blinked hard, trying to clear my vision, but the effect persisted. The kitchen around me felt suddenly foreign, as if I were seeing it through someone else's eyes. The refrigerator hummed a tune I almost recognized, and the shadows cast by the overhead light formed shapes that looked almost like letters, spelling out words I couldn't quite read. I needed air, needed to get outside and clear my head, but when I reached for the front door, it wouldn't open. The handle turned freely, but the door itself remained sealed as if painted shut. I pulled harder than pushed, but it held firm against my efforts. The back door was the same, immovable despite the fact that both locks were clearly disengaged. Panic began to rise in my throat, metallic and sharp. I was trapped, though that was impossible. Doors didn't just stop working, and I had the keys to both locks. But no matter how I tried, neither door would budge. The windows were painted shut, had been since I moved in, another project I'd been meaning to tackle when I had time. I sat down heavily on the couch, trying to think rationally about the situation. There had to be an explanation. Maybe the humidity had caused the wood to swell, jamming the doors in their frames. Maybe I was pushing when I should pull, or vice versa. Simple problems with simple solutions, nothing more sinister than old wood and older hardware. But sitting there in the growing darkness, with the photograph staring at me from the kitchen counter and the scratch starting up again at the front door, rational explanations felt as substantial as smoke. The house around me seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, walls expanding and contracting in rhythm with my own racing pulse. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a sound I recognized but couldn't place. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the house from outside. They paused at each window, and I found myself holding my breath, waiting for whatever was out there to move on to the next one. But the footsteps weren't random. They were methodical, purposeful, as if someone were checking each potential entry point. Or as if someone were making sure I couldn't leave. The thought came unbidden, and with it a flood of sensations that didn't match my current situation. The taste of copper in my mouth, the feeling of rope against my wrists, the sound of someone crying in a voice that might have been my own. These weren't memories exactly, more like echoes of experiences that belonged to someone else. But they felt real in a way that my rational explanations didn't. I found myself walking back toward the basement door, though I had no conscious intention of going there. My feet carried me down the creaking steps as if following a path they'd traveled many times before. The darkness below was complete now, but somehow I navigated it easily, avoiding obstacles I couldn't see but knew were there. The cleared space in the center of the floor felt warm under my bare feet, though the rest of the concrete was cold and damp. I knelt down and pressed my palms against the stains, and suddenly the basement wasn't empty anymore. Shadows moved in my peripheral vision, and voices whispered words I couldn't quite understand, but somehow knew were meant for me. The woman from the photograph was there, no longer rigid with fear, but moving freely through the space as if she belonged there. She looked at me with eyes full of sadness and something that might have been forgiveness. When she spoke, her voice came from very far away, like an echo reaching me across a vast distance. "You remember now," she said, and I did. Not everything, not all at once, but enough to understand that the story I'd been telling myself was wrong. I hadn't found the photograph in an envelope by the door. I'd taken it myself long ago in this very house. The woman wasn't a stranger, but someone I'd known well, someone who trusted me enough to come here alone. The man by the window wasn't looking outside but at me, and his reflected gaze wasn't curious but afraid. Afraid of what I might do, what I was already planning to do, what I had done in the space that was now clear and stained in the center of the basement floor. But even as these fragments of memory surfaced, another part of my mind rejected them. I wasn't capable of what they suggested. I was the victim here, trapped in a house that wouldn't let me leave, tormented by photographs and messages left by someone else. The rational explanation was still there, still possible, still more believable than the alternative my subconscious was trying to force me to accept. I stumbled back up the stairs, leaving the basement and its whispered accusations behind. The photograph was gone from the kitchen counter, but I could still see it clearly in my mind. The woman's face, the man's reflected terror, the careful composition that suggested someone had posed them deliberately. The front door opened easily now, swinging wide to reveal the empty porch and the night beyond. I could leave if I wanted to, could walk away from this house and its impossible memories, drive until I found a place with working phones and rational explanations for everything that had happened. But I didn't move toward the door. Instead, I found myself looking back toward the basement, where shadows still moved in the darkness and voices still whispered truths I wasn't ready to hear. The house held its secrets close, but it was willing to share them with someone patient enough to listen. And I was beginning to understand that patience might be all I had left. The night air moved through the open door, carrying with it the scent of earth and growing things. But underneath those natural smells was something else, something that reminded me of the basement and its cleared circle, and the woman whose name I was trying very hard not to remember. I stood in the doorway between inside and outside, between the story I wanted to believe and the one that might actually be true, unable to choose which direction to go. The house waited behind me, patient and knowing. The world waited ahead, full of possibilities and explanations and ways to forget. But forgetting, I was beginning to realize, might not be an option anymore. Story 10. The clock ticked, but my heartbeat skipped, echoing an old rhythm that felt misplaced. My fingers traced the table's surface, stopping at a worn groove that I didn't remember. The curtains draped tiredly, their folds unfamiliar, catching the morning light in a way that twisted reality. The floor creaked beneath untouched tiles, every step a discordant whisper. On the counter, a mug sat steaming, though I had not boiled the kettle. My reflection in the window stared back at me, eyes wide with recognition, yet the face felt like someone else's. I knew exactly what had happened that night. The sequence of events played in my mind with crystalline clarity, each moment fitting perfectly into the next like pieces of a well-crafted puzzle. I had been working late again, hunched over my laptop at the kitchen table, the blue glow illuminating stacks of papers that needed reviewing. The house was quiet except for the familiar hum of the refrigerator and the occasional settling of old wood. Around midnight, I heard the front door open. Footsteps moved through the hallway with deliberate slowness, and I called out a greeting without looking up from my screen. The response came as expected, tired acknowledgement, the rustle of a coat being hung, keys dropping into the ceramic bowl by the entrance. Normal sounds of arrival, nothing unusual. I finished my work around 1 a.m, saved my files, and closed the laptop. The house had fallen completely silent by then. I assumed sleep had already claimed the other occupant of the house, so I moved quietly through my nighttime routine. Checked the locks, turned off the lights, brushed my teeth in the dark bathroom to avoid disturbing anyone. But something about that groove in the table bothered me. My finger kept returning to it as I reconstructed the evening, feeling its smooth depression worn by countless repetitive motions. When had it appeared? The table was old, certainly, but I prided myself on noticing details, on maintaining awareness of my surroundings. This mark felt both ancient and impossibly fresh. The mug on the counter steamed with coffee that smelled wrong. Not unpleasant, but foreign somehow, like a blend I had never purchased. I lifted it to my lips and tasted something that should have been familiar but wasn't quite right, too bitter or perhaps too sweet. The ceramic felt warm against my palms, but the heat seemed to come from within the cup itself rather than from the liquid it contained. My reflection in the window shifted slightly, though I remained perfectly still. The morning light created shadows across my face that emphasized features I didn't recognize: sharper cheekbones, deeper set eyes, a mouth that seemed to hold secrets I had never learned. I blinked, and for a moment the reflection blinked back a fraction of a second too late. The logical explanation remained clear in my mind. After finishing work, I had gone to bed and slept soundly until morning. Dreams had been vivid but forgettable, the kind that leave emotional residue without concrete memories. I woke naturally, without an alarm, feeling rested but somehow displaced. The morning routine proceeded normally: shower, coffee, checking messages on my phone. Yet my body remembered different sensations. My muscles held tension from movements I couldn't recall making. My throat felt raw, as if I had been talking or perhaps shouting for hours. The soles of my feet were tender, suggesting long periods of standing or walking on hard surfaces. When I examined them, I found no visible signs of wear or injury, but the soreness persisted. The house itself seemed to whisper contradictions. Doors stood slightly ajar that I remembered closing. A window in the back room was unlocked, though I maintained strict security habits. The thermostat had been adjusted to a temperature I never preferred. Small displacements that could easily be explained by forgetfulness or the natural settling of an old building, but they accumulated into a pattern that felt intentional. I found myself drawn to the basement door, though I rarely ventured down there. The handle was cold under my palm, colder than the ambient temperature could justify. When I turned it, the hinges moved silently, as if they had been recently oiled. The stairs descended into darkness that seemed thicker than mere absence of light. The basement smelled of earth and something metallic that made my sinuses ache. I flicked the light switch, and the bulb illuminated concrete walls that appeared damp despite the dry weather we had been experiencing. In the corner, a chair sat facing the wall, positioned as if someone had been sitting there for hours, staring at the blank surface. But I had no reason to go to the basement that night. My logical mind insisted on this fact. The evening had been spent working, then sleeping. The basement door had remained locked, as always. The chair had been positioned that way for months, maybe years. I simply hadn't noticed it before because I rarely spent time in that part of the house. My hands began to shake as I climbed back upstairs. The tremor started in my fingertips and spread up through my wrists and forearms. I tried to attribute it to low blood sugar or too much caffeine, but the shaking felt different, more like an echo of previous trembling, muscle memory of fear or exertion I couldn't consciously access. The phone rang and I jumped at the sound. The caller's voice was familiar but strained, asking questions I couldn't quite follow. Something about last night, about whether I was all right, about sounds that had been heard. I provided reassuring answers automatically, but the conversation left me more unsettled than before. After hanging up, I noticed that my clothes from the previous day were missing from the hamper where I always placed them. I searched through the laundry room, the bedroom, even checked the washing machine, but they were nowhere to be found. In their place, I discovered garments I didn't recognize: a shirt with sleeves that showed signs of recent washing, pants with knees that appeared to have been scrubbed clean. The afternoon brought more visitors, more questions, more concerned expressions that I couldn't fully interpret. People spoke carefully, watching my reactions, offering help I didn't understand needing. Their eyes held a mixture of sympathy and something else: wariness, perhaps, or a kind of careful distance. I maintained my version of events with increasing insistence. The evening had been normal. I had worked, then slept. Nothing unusual had occurred. But even as I spoke these truths, my body betrayed me with involuntary responses: a flinch when someone mentioned the basement, a catch in my breath when asked about specific times, a tendency to look away when describing my certainty about the sequence of events. As darkness approached again, the house seemed to hold its breath. The familiar sounds of settling wood and shifting foundation took on ominous qualities. The groove in the table felt deeper under my fingertips, as if it had been worn by decades of nervous repetition rather than casual use. The curtains moved without any detectable breeze, their folds casting shadows that resembled figures in my peripheral vision. I found myself standing at the basement door again, though I had no memory of walking there. My hand rested on the handle, and I could feel a vibration through the metal, not mechanical, but organic, like a pulse or breathing. The cold seemed to emanate from whatever lay beyond the door, seeping through the wood and into my palm. The truth felt layered, like sedimentary rock with different eras compressed into a single formation. What I knew to be true existed alongside what my body insisted had happened, and the two versions created a pressure that threatened to crack my understanding of reality itself. The morning light that had initially seemed so clear now appeared harsh and artificial, illuminating details that made less sense the longer I observed them. The mug on the counter had grown cold, but steam still rose from its surface in impossible spirals. My reflection in the window now showed someone I almost recognized, features that shifted between familiar and strange depending on the angle of light. The house around me felt both like home and like a stage set designed to resemble home, accurate in every detail except for some fundamental quality that remained just beyond identification. I knew what had happened. I also knew that what had happened was something else entirely. Both truths coexisted in my mind without resolution, creating a tension that seemed to stretch time itself. The clock continued ticking, but my heartbeat had found its own rhythm, one that felt both foreign and deeply, troublingly familiar. The groove in the table led my finger in circles, wearing the path deeper with each repetition, and I wondered if I was creating it or simply following a pattern that had always been there, waiting for me to discover it.